Picture a farmhouse in rural Stark County, Ohio. Fields pressed flat by wind, church bells for punctuation. The evening so clean you can hear the hum of a power line. Inside that house, no TV, no video games, no secular radio. Just bluegrass instruments on their hooks, and a family whose days ran like a metronome. Chores, practice, prayer, repeat. They called themselves the Stockdale Family Band. Polished instruments, polished smiles. 4 sons in matching vests, mom and dad on rhythm and harmony. If you caught them at a county fair, you'd swear you were looking at a postcard mailed from a simpler century. You might have seen them on TV once, not for music, but for rules. In 2008, the Stockdales opened their door to a reality show experiment, and America stared back. The episode framed them as devout, homeschooled, tightly controlled. Catherine, the mother, laid it out without apology. What the boys listened to, what they read, where they went, who they could be with. All of it ran through the parents first. Dating? Number. Secular media? Number. Obedience? Non-negotiable. To some, it read like discipline. To others, like a pressure cooker with the valve welded shut. Years pass. Rules do what rules do. They hold. The family keeps touring, keeps smiling, keeps living inside a careful bubble on Route 212 near Beach City/Bethlehem Township. The band wins a little local fame. The brothers, Calvin, Charles, Jacob, James, learn to harmonize until their voices click like puzzle pieces. Their mother, Catherine, is the glue. Their father, Timothy, is the frame. If that's where the story ended, it would be a brochure. How to build a wholesome life in 12 easy steps. But on a Thursday afternoon in June 2017, a thin line between wholesome and harmful snapped like an overstretched string, and the sound still hasn't stopped ringing. Here's what the sheriff's logs will never be able to explain with numbers. How a house that banned static could suddenly fill with the loudest silence in Stark County. A 911 hang-up. Deputies rolling past corn and fence posts toward a home they'd probably driven by 100 times. A door. A pause. And then a shockwave. 2 bodies inside. A third person down. A gun on the floor. Blood turning hardwood into mirror. Even veteran responders had to stop and breathe. The names matter, so say them now. Catherine Stockdale, 54. Mother, singer, rule writer, the hand on the family's moral metronome. James Stockdale, 21. Youngest son, bass in the band, still standing on the edge of everything. And the shooter? Another son, a brother, Jacob, 25. He wasn't a shadow. He was the third harmony, the clean banjo break, the boy next to you in every family photo. According to investigators, he fired the shots that killed his mother and his youngest brother. Then, in a moment that splits the room even now, he turned the gun on himself and lived. If it already feels like a magic trick, power, postcard turned inside out. That's because so much of this case sits in the friction between image and impact. The image? Modest uniforms, good posture, tight smiles, a band that tuned by ear and tuned their lives to one idea: purity through control. The impact: a family reduced in seconds to a nightmare headline: wife swap murders. Let's not race. This series isn't a sprint to a verdict. It's a walk through a house that refuses to be simple. Start in the front room where the instruments hung. Mandolin, fiddle, banjo, upright bass. Imagine every practice rep, every heated discussion smoothed over with one more chorus of "Will the circle be unbroken?" Walk past the fridge with chore charts magneted into place. Pause by the bulletin board with festival dates and church potlucks thumbtacked in rows. The Stockdales didn't just live by rules, they ran on them. For a long time it seemed to work. And yet, even in the 2008 TV episode, you can see hairline cracks, that only make sense now. The visiting swap mother describes a teenager who bolts outside crying when offered small freedoms. A movie, an hour of radio, a night out. Not excitement, fear. Fear that breaking a rule meant breaking everything. Fear that fun was a trap door. Fear that one yes would erase every no his life was built on. Turn that detail over in your hand. If joy itself is framed as a sin, what happens when normal adolescent pressure climbs a ladder and finds no roof vent? If every misstep carries eternal stakes, what kind of panic blooms in a brain already wired tight? These aren't excuses, they're context. The difference between a tabloid headline and a human landscape. June 15th, 2017, midday. The farmhouse doesn't announce itself. The neighbors don't hear a barrage. There's no siren until there is. Deputies are dispatched to a hang-up call. The kind that makes watch commanders frown because it can mean anything. They arrive. A shot rings out as they approach or just before they cross the threshold. Accounts land within the same breath. Inside, Catherine, gone. James, gone. Jacob, barely clinging. A self-inflicted wound that didn't erase the questions it tried to silence. The questions pile up anyway. Where was Timothy? At work. Where were the older brothers? Out of the house, living their own adult lives. Was there a note? Not one the public ever saw? A fight? A crisis? A trigger? Nothing that survived the official record as a clean motive. Why? The word that never gets a satisfying answer. What you will find, across a dozen reports and courtroom summaries, is a strange duet: control and collapse. On one side, a family proud of its guardrails. A home that kept out what the parents believed would corrupt their sons. On the other, the reality that human beings are pressure systems, and when one fails, it fails catastrophically. By evening, the band website reads like a ghost light. The Suns. Bios still smile. The booking contact still invites your email, but the phones aren't ringing for gigs anymore. Reporters say the names carefully. The reality show clips resurface, and armchair experts connect dots that maybe shouldn't be connected so quickly. It's an American reflex. Find a headline-shaped reason, file the pain away. But the only honest way to enter this case is slowly. In the days after the shootings, Jacob is airlifted, then moved, then kept under round-the-clock care. Bone, blood, brain. Competency hearings will shadow the next few years. There will be talk of an insanity plea, talk of restoring competency to stand trial, talk of a final courtroom chapter where a judge reads out the number that replaces a future. That's ahead. We're not there yet. For now, hold the first picture. A mother with a songbook voice, a youngest son who could make a bass sound like a heartbeat, and a house whose very brand was no static. Then hold the second picture. Deputies stepping into a silence that screamed. If the paradox makes your head hurt, good. It should. Because this isn't just a true crime headline. It's a study in how an identity, "we are the good family," can become a wall so high no one inside can see a cliff coming. The clock on the Stark County dispatcher's desk read about 4:30 p.m., a June afternoon slipping into early evening. The kind of time when farm trucks head home and the heat lifts off the fields in waves. The call wasn't a scream or a whisper or a speech. It was the worst kind of message law enforcement gets. A 911 hang-up. Nothing on the line but the hiss of a connection that cut itself off. Protocol is boring on purpose. You send a car. In a place like Bethlehem Township, that car knows the roads by memory. Route 212, Dolphin Street Southwest, the short runs between mailbox clusters and the river bends. Deputies rolled out expecting almost anything and secretly hoping for nothing. A pocket dial, a kid messing around, somebody bumping their phone on a countertop. What they got instead was a sound no officer forgets. A single gunshot, close enough that it felt like the house coughed. The deputies moved, training taking over the parts of their bodies that wanted to freeze. The door, the threshold, the smell. And then the picture snapped into place. 2 people down inside the farmhouse, and a third, alive but gravely wounded by what appeared to be a self-inflicted shot. The names wouldn't be official until the coroner said them, but everyone in uniform already knew this address. It was the Stockdale place, the family band, the strict home, the bluegrass kids with perfect posture. Now it was a crime scene layered in shock. Catherine, 54, was gone. James, 21, the youngest, was gone. And Jacob, 25, the shooter, was somehow still breathing. You can measure the rest of that evening by what professional people did quickly. One team cleared rooms and secured the structure. Another triaged Jacob and coordinated the airlift to Cleveland because only a trauma center had a shot at pulling him back. Detectives started the slow work, marking the weapon, photographing casings and footprints and smear patterns that would mean something later, building that first rough timeline that lets a case survive the chaos of day one. They also did what deputies in small places always have to do: step onto the porch and face the first neighbor drawn by squad lights. You could feel the question before anyone said it. What happened? And then the stranger, harsher one: why? Wife swap murders. The phrase wasn't born that day, but it found its shape in the hours after. Someone remembered the 2008 reality TV episode, The Strictest Rules Family, the mother who controlled media like it was stormwater barreling toward the house. Clips floated back onto the internet with their bright-lit awkwardness. The boys rehearsing, mom outlining bands on TV, video games, secular music, dating, the visiting swap mom watching a teenager panic and cry when asked to try a normal teen freedom for an afternoon. The country stared with the particular cruelty of hindsight and decided that the rules must be the whole story. But inside the tape line, investigators avoided that trap. Facts first, the hang-up. The single shot as deputies arrived. The evidence that 2 victims had already been killed before a third round was fired into the shooter's own head. No sign of a stranger. No prints that led to some outsider with a grudge. The violence landed inside the family's orbit and stayed there. Newsrooms did their part. Confirm the who, what, where. Don't guess at the why. A statement from the family asked for privacy, and for the first time since the band started playing fairs and fellowship halls, the Stockdales weren't a unit. They were a fracture with empty chairs and hospital bracelets. From that night forward, the story ran on 2 tracks. Track 1 was medical. Jacob went from the farmhouse floor to a Cleveland trauma hospital, then through the clipped, grim vocabulary of neurosurgeons. Stabilize, operate, observe, rehab. Weeks became months. If you've never watched a major head wound case move, you might think recovery is a movie montage. It's not. It's a chart stacked with pain scores and scans and small, stubborn gains. By the time he left intensive care, the legal system had already begun to build the second track under his feet. Track 2 was criminal, because 2 people were dead and the person believed to have killed them was now, against his own attempt, still alive. The Stark County Sheriff's Office and the prosecutor dealt with the human part of waiting. Families burying their dead, while the suspect learned to walk and speak again. And the legal part of charging a man who, for a while, couldn't stand trial even if he wanted to. That's where the phrase competency to stand trial enters the file. It isn't mercy, it's due process. A defendant has to understand what's happening and be able to help his lawyers. Early on, Jacob pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and the court sent him for extended psychiatric evaluation and treatment. News briefs stacked up across 2019 and early 2020 about competency hearings. Some doctors saying not yet, another judge order sending him back for more treatment, and then, at last, a ruling that he was competent to proceed. That slow, bureaucratic march was its own kind of headline. This case would not vanish under the fog of injury. Meanwhile, the public narrative kept trying to simplify what refused to be simple. Talk shows and social feeds wanted a one-word fuse: rules. If the family had been less strict, this wouldn't have happened. If they had been more strict, this wouldn't have happened. The argument flipped both ways depending on who was posting. But inside filings and sworn statements, the closest thing to an official answer was the most honest one: no clear motive. Investigators didn't find a manifesto, a diary confession, a screenshot that tied a neat bow around the horror. What they had, and would carry into court, was sequence and responsibility. They had the call at 4:30. They had the deputy's arrival and the single shot that followed. They had two victims, Catherine and James, both shot dead before law enforcement crossed the threshold. They had the shooter, Jacob, who tried to end his own life and failed. They had a family's history rendered suddenly irrelevant by the hardest facts in the room: ballistics, blood, time, proximity. As summer turned, the Stockdale family band faded from festival posters. The website went static. Timothy, the father, faced a double grief most people can't even look at straight on: a wife and son gone, another son alive and accused of killing them. The older brothers, Calvin and Charles, kept their distance from the cameras. The story that had once sold tickets now asked for silence. The indictment came later, when grand jurors formally accused Jacob of 2 counts of murder tied to June 15, 2017. He turned himself in after rehab, booked not as a folk curiosity, but as a defendant. Even then, the machinery moved carefully: hearings, reports, competency reviews, the slow boil of a case that had to respect both medicine and law. If you're looking for a clean moment where the why appears, you won't find it in part 2. That's the point. The wife swap label is a sticky shortcut, but it isn't a motive. The strict rules are a context, but they aren't a cause. The truth that survived the first years is simpler and harder. A family known for control experienced a collapse so sudden that no one could catch it in time. So we leave the farmhouse in the hands of custodians and cleaners and return to the courthouse, where the next chapters wait in fluorescent light. Competency restored, plea entered, and a sentencing script that trades the unknown of a jury for the certainty of a number. Courtrooms look nothing like the storms that drive people into them. They're fluorescent, orderly, predictable by design. That's the point: to take chaos and turn it into paragraphs. When Jacob Stockdale finally entered one under his own power, it wasn't just a step from hospital to courthouse. It was the system announcing quietly but clearly that this case would no longer live in the waiting room. For years after the shootings, the file moved in careful inches. Doctors first, lawyers second. You can't try a man who doesn't understand what's happening to him, who can't answer basic questions about the charges with more than a fog. The phrase is dry: competency to stand trial. But the stakes are all human. Competency is not a verdict on guilt or on sanity at the time of the act. It's a present tense question: does he get what this is? Can he sit beside his attorneys, follow the language of the room, make choices that actually belong to him? So Jacob's life became a rotation of white walls and clipped voices: evaluation, treatment, re-evaluation. Reports stacked up like winter drifts. Some said, "not yet." Others sketched a path forward. With medication and therapy, comprehension returned in measurable steps. Meanwhile, the criminal case waited on the other side of a locked door. The law is slow on purpose, when a person's mind has to be rebuilt enough to face it. All the while, the charges sat like fixed stars. The deaths of Catherine and James, a mother, a youngest son, a house where the silence screamed. Nothing in the medical notes could move those facts. When a judge finally ruled that Jacob was competent, everything shifted. The calendars came out. Hearings got real dates. The paperwork traded possibly and projected for scheduled and ordered. Alongside the competency track, another legal lane had been humming since early on: insanity. Early in the process, Jacob entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, a bridge between what happened in June and what might have been happening inside his head at the time. Insanity is not a mood or a label. It's a narrow legal test about whether a person understood the wrongfulness of his acts when he committed them. Most jurors never see a true insanity verdict in their lives. It's a high bar and a hard argument. In conference rooms without cameras, lawyers did the math that trial lawyers always do. They weighed risk, not just the risk of losing, but the risk of what a public trial would force a family to hear out loud. The 911 hang-up, the deputies at the door, the scene that no one should have to sit through in slow motion, frame by frame, under oath. They weighed the witnesses and the forensic sequence against the complicated medical record. And they weighed something else you can't footnote: the father's double grief. Timothy Stockdale had already buried a wife and a son. A trial would ask him to relive the worst afternoon of his life in a room full of strangers. In the end, the case did what so many catastrophic cases do. It moved toward a plea. Not the early insanity plea, this was different. This was the moment where a defendant acknowledges the core of what the state has to prove, and the state, in turn, removes the roulette wheel of a jury and replaces it with the certainty of a sentence. There's nothing cinematic about it. A judge asks questions in a rhythm designed to protect everyone's rights. Are you thinking clearly? Do you understand the charges? Do you understand the possible sentence? Has anyone forced you? Are you satisfied with your lawyers? Does this plea reflect what you choose to do today? Each yes tightens the knot. Each yes moves the case from the fog of what-ifs to the floor of what is. Victim impact is where the air changes. Courtrooms are built for evidence, but they have to make space for love and loss too. A statement read into the record doesn't fix anything, and it doesn't have to. It exists to put the people back into a story that can get swallowed by exhibits. Catherine wasn't just a name on a docket. She was a singer, a planner, a mother whose hands set the metronome of a family. James wasn't just an age in a police report. He was a youngest son with a bass that thumped like a heart. The words spoken for them don't compete with the law. They complete it. Then the judge speaks, and the case crosses its final threshold. There is no sentence that feels like a match to what happened in that farmhouse. Courts don't do equivalence, they do accountability. What came down was a lengthy, indeterminate prison term measured in decades, time that recognizes 2 lives taken and another nearly cut short. It was the kind of number that closes the state's book even as it leaves the family with chapters no court can resolve. If you're listening for a clean motive here, the transcript won't hand you one. There was no manifesto cut and pasted into the record, no diary page that made sense of the senseless. What the case leaves behind is a tangle of control and collapse. A family that believed in guardrails so strongly that the rails became the road. A son whose mind unraveled in that controlled space until it broke in a way the law can punish but never fully explain. That isn't a satisfying answer, and it's the only honest one. Some people wanted the trial that never happened, a weeks-long march of exhibits and experts that might have offered a sentence-length narrative for why. But trials don't promise whys. Trials promise proof. And here, proof was never the problem. The question wasn't who committed the acts inside the farmhouse. It was whether the system would treat the shooter as a patient or a defendant, and how much of each. The final orders said defendant, with an asterisk the size of a medical file. What about the older brothers? Their names are not part of the public script in any sensational way, and that, in itself, is a mercy. They grew up in the same house, under the same rules, played the same stages. Their adulthood now includes absence, the missing chair at holidays, the empty mic stand, the phone numbers you keep saved even when you can't use them anymore. Cases leave survivors, with jobs the law never sees, caring for aging parents, shepherding memories, answering questions from children who weren't born when the headline hit. And Timothy? The father's role, after sentencing lives in the quiet places, visiting rooms, letters, prayers spoken in kitchens. He occupies the strangest square anyone can stand on, both bereaved and related to the person who caused the bereavement. The court can't solve that geometry. It can only draw its lines where the statute book tells it to and leave the rest to the slow work of time. When the hearing ended, the room folded itself back up the way courtrooms always do. Files bundled, microphones switched off, benches creaking as they emptied. Outside, the news cycle wrote its last paragraph on a case it had once called the wife swap murders, a nickname that feels smaller and meaner the longer you sit with the facts. The show was a note in a much larger chord. The chord is this: a family built on no static met a kind of noise no one could mute. By the time the transport van pulled away, the legal story was over. The human story kept going, in therapies and grace and anger and grief that shows up in ordinary ways, like a song on the radio that you change, even if it isn't the one you were thinking about. That's where these cases really live after the headlines have gone. Not in the clang of handcuffs, but in the quiet that follows. After a case closes, the cameras fold up like lawn chairs and go looking for the next storm. What's left behind isn't cinematic. It's ordinary life with pieces missing. The Stockdale farmhouse still stands against Ohio weather, but it no longer carries the sound the family built there. No twin fiddles warming up, no metronome tapping the kitchen table, no brothers negotiating a harmony by feel. Houses learn to keep secrets after violence, and the people who pass them learn to stop staring. But if you've ever lived near a place like that, you know, the air changes a little when you drive by. Not fear, something slower. Reverence maybe, or caution. The human version of dimming your headlights. In the community, memories learn to live in the present tense. You'd hear it at a farm stand or after church, not as gossip, but as small, tender facts that keep the people from becoming only a headline. Someone would mention how Catherine could turn a rehearsal into a potluck by the end of the first verse. How she knew which festival needed a hymn at the end of a set, and which one needed a fast closer and a smile. How her laugh filled a room like good light. James's name landed differently, softer at the edges, the way youngest children's names often do. He was the bass that made the song feel like a heartbeat. The brother who still had firsts ahead of him, first serious road trip on his own, first apartment with a kitchen that wasn't quite big enough, first time getting carded at a restaurant and grinning like it. Proved something. When people said his name, it sounded like a line they weren't finished writing. After sentencing, the legal story took its seat in the archives, right where it belongs. Searchable, stable, available, but quiet. The human story continued in places the record doesn't reach: family calendars, spare rooms, boxes of sheet music. Nobody quite knows how to sort. Grief isn't a single feeling, it's a rotation. Shock becomes rage, becomes exhaustion, becomes a few good days in a row, becomes a song on the radio you didn't expect, and now you're parked in a grocery lot trying to breathe through a verse you've heard 100 times. That rotation is the real aftermath. For the older brothers, Adulthood now included logistics most families never have to learn: estates, paperwork, the small bureaucratic errands that force you to say the names and the dates to strangers behind counters. They also learned the long, private work of deciding what to keep. Do you hold on to the banjo that still knows the shape of your brother's hands? Do you store the matching vests in plastic and try not to imagine their ghosts on a stage? There isn't a right answer. There's only the one that lets you sleep. The father's road is harder to look at. There is no word that covers losing a spouse and a child to violence while another son carries the blame. Language bows out and leaves a man alone with decisions he never imagined he'd need to make. What to say in visiting rooms, what not to say at gravesides, how to tell the truth to people who need different truths to keep going. The math of that position doesn't solve. It balances for a moment and then tips again. It's the place where faith, anger, forgiveness, and fatigue take turns driving. Friends of the family learned a strange new etiquette: how to honor a memory without interrogating it, how to speak a name without making a room stop breathing. Communities are good at that, retraining their instincts until kindness is the default again. Someone drops off soup without ringing the bell. Someone else mows a lawn without being asked. All the old cliches become holy: a casserole, a prayer, a ride, a listening ear. It's not a fix, it's a scaffold. The music didn't die. It changed addresses. Those who had stood in the audience of the Stockdale family band carried the tunes forward in humming and in church pews and in small private strums on porches at dusk. Grief is stubborn about making beauty travel. You'll hear a line from an old hymn in a new voice and feel a kind of relief you can't quite name. That's how remembrance works when it's healthy. It refuses to let the worst thing be the only thing. People kept asking the same question even after the sentence made the newspapers fold. Why? Not in the courtroom sense, motive to attach to a charge, but in the human sense. Why here? Why us? Why this house that worked so hard to keep the noise out? The honest answer stayed the same. There isn't a single sentence that carries all the weight. You can talk about control and collapse, about a family's attempt to build guardrails so strong the road disappeared, about a mind that broke in a place that didn't have language for broken minds. Each of those is a piece. None is the whole picture. The temptation will always be to pick the piece that offends you least and pretend it's the whole. Resist that. Integrity demands complexity. What about the label the world slapped on the case, the wife swap shorthand that fits neatly into headlines and algorithms? It's hard to overstate how small that phrase feels now. The show was a lens, not a cause. It offered a snapshot of a family that believed in hard lines, but reality TV is terrible at context and worse at aftermath. The people who knew the Stockdales learned to avoid the nickname out of respect. The case has a name in the files. The people have names at the cemetery. In time, you can feel the town regain its balance. You see it in small civic things: new volunteer signups, full bake sale tables, the return of ordinary complaints about weather and roads. Recovery in a place like this isn't triumphant, it's practical. The best kind of healing is often indistinguishable from maintenance. Community is a chore, and chores done well make homes livable. If you followed this story through all 4 parts, you know our rule. We finish with the people, not the act. So here's the shape of remembrance that doesn't exploit and doesn't forget. We remember Catherine Stockdale as more than a mother in a headline. We remember the way she built schedules like scaffolds for songs, the way hospitality lived in her hands, the clarity with which she believed she was protecting her sons, even when the rest of the world didn't understand. To remember her is not to endorse or condemn her rules. It is to honor her humanity. We remember James Stockdale as more than a number on a coroner's report. We remember the bass line that steadied the tune, the easy grin of the youngest, the sense that his adult life was just beginning to speak in its own voice. To remember him is to recover his future from the story that stole it. And we remember, too, what it costs to tell a true story about a family in public. Privacy isn't a loophole, it's a shelter. When you talk about what happened here, keep the shelter intact. Don't turn grief into trivia. Don't turn rules into a punchline. If you share the story, share the responsibility that comes with it, to center the dead and to do no harm to the living. There is a line from an old hymn the family surely knew. Will the circle be unbroken? The question mark is the part that matters. Circles break. The miracle is that some are repaired, not by pretending they never broke, but by joining hands around the gap. The Stockdale's circle is smaller now and shaped differently, but the joining is real. You can see it in the way people still say the names, as if they're lighting candles. That's where we end. Catherine Stockdale, James Stockdale. Say them out loud. Not because it changes the past, but because it keeps the present honest. Stories like this don't ask us for outrage so much as they ask us for steadiness. Pay attention to the quiet houses. Check on your people. Accept that sometimes the most dangerous thing is the story we tell ourselves about how safe we are. And when the worst happens, do the most ordinary, courageous thing there is. Remember, if you want true stories told without sensationalism, with the victims at the center, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next episode. In the comments, honor their names: Catherine Stockdale and James Stockdale. Share responsibly. Your support helps us keep making careful, respectful storytelling.